Okay, so we're gradually getting there. And what I'm now going to do...
How many places have you got there? Eh?
Oh, no, it's not. Participants. Is that Ronnie? Is that Ronnie talking in the background again?
Yes, you can, exactly.
Right, I'm
never
going to...
stops. He never stops talking.
What?
Right, that's it. I'm muting the lot of you.
Who said that?
Right. Right. Now, I allow Tom to ask him to unmute. And I've got to make you co-host.
That would be great.
Yes, I do. And where you've moved, oh, you're up here. And then I go to Spotlight Video. Okay, and then I go to Abigail, who's there. And I ask her to unmute. And then I go to there and I make her a co-host. Yes, I do. I'm getting, within another 2 years, I'm going to be really spot on this stuff.
How regularly are you doing Zoom events?
Well, I was telling Abigail, I was doing it once a week for about 15 months. And then, but in the last, as the summer's got closer and the restrictions have lifted somewhat, then I've gone out to once a month and trying to pick up some lighter, some slightly different themes than we were in the first place. Actually, using having the first of our presentations from Abigail was part of that. We did. I thought it would be good, and in retrospect, I'm not sure now. I thought it would be good to do stories of survival at the beginning. So we did surviving isolation, and we had Sharansky talking to us about his experiences in prison. We had somebody who was on the space station for 6 months, International Space Station.
Wow.
And a submariner. And then we moved on to surviving the Second World War with some extraordinary tales from members of our community, from people who'd been in concentration camps as a baby, people on the kinder transport, and then people in the forces, in the Far East and the Middle East. But I saw it only attracted a particular generation. And for many others, it was like, yeah, we don't really want to hear about the war anymore. Okay, we're doing quite well. It's not quite 8 o'clock, and I see we're beginning to get a crowd on. They're all hopeful that if you give them an exam at the end, they get a degree from one of your universities. So it's very exciting. And we've already done, this is our second module with Abigail, so you can see we're building up there.
What was Abigail's first paper?
Oh, it was her talk on Moses Montefiore and Judith Montefiore, an extraordinary biography. It was like, it was easy to read and it was so well researched at the same time. It was amazing to read, and they a remarkable life. There we go. We've got a couple of our, the kids from our community are up in Durham, at University in Durham.
Oh, great.
Doing politics and things like that. Which is it's a wonderful.
Have they actually physically been there this year, David, or are they?
Yes, they have been a little bit. One of them isolated because of something or another for 10 days. And then somebody in his house got COVID. So he had to go. So he was locked up for 20 days. As his mother said, fortunately, he's got a very passive, gentle personality. Others would have gone absolutely bonkers. So he did very well there. Okay, and I'm going to make one of my friends a co-host just in case my computer collapses. So we've got 4 co-hosts now. Okay.
I was just going to say to Abigail, I had a very nice exchange with Izzy a minute ago, who tells me that Simon Sharma retweeted something today from the JCH, which is great.
Not just that, but it was Louisa's article.
Oh, fantastic.
So obviously very exciting for Louisa. Louisa wrote something about Italian Jewish women for the JWA. You know, they've relaunched the JWA this week.
JWA?
The Jewish Women's Archive.
Oh, right, because it also means Jewish Women's Aid.
No, well, it may do.
It's the abuse charity.
Archive. So We had, because Michelle Klein wrote something about Hannah Floretta Cohen for it. And Louisa obviously wrote this, so we tweeted about both of them. And yes, Simon Sharma retweeted Louisa's article. So Louisa was obviously amazed because he has a huge audience.
Well, I was fortunate enough to be present at Simon Sharma's first ever public lecture. He had gone to haberdashers, and his head teacher, his history teacher, was so proud of him that when he graduated, he'd then become headmaster of our school. He got Simon to come and lecture us just after he graduated from uni. And so I was present at Simon Sharma's first ever public lecture.
And was he good?
It was 55 years ago. He probably was. He probably was. He does tell jokes very well. He tells some great jokes. I've seen him do stuff on stage. Okay, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, it is 8 o'clock. We haven't had a Zoom for a while because everybody's been going out, enjoying themselves, eating at restaurants and getting into the open air at last and being able to breathe. And that is fantastic. And just hearing Abigail had a very exciting experience a few days ago. She went to shul. I'm not suggesting that she doesn't normally go to shul. It was the first time in a long time for a family simcha. So a mazel tov there, and it's lovely that you all got there. Ladies and gentlemen, it's an extraordinary privilege we have tonight to have two top historians address just us. It really is phenomenal. It's I wasn't sure when you saw the title Jewish Country Houses whether you were thinking, what's he talking about? You know, a house out in Stanmore somewhere, or talking about Radler or what, Shenley. But I think we're going to hear it's rather different than that, and that they are the seat of developments, of remarkable developments in history. Tom is a professor of modern European history at the University of Durham, where, as I was just saying, we've got Joe Gelman's up there. I know Nathan's applying up there at the moment. If you'd look out for his application, please, Tom. We'll appreciate that one. And Tom was looking at post-revolutionary Paris as one of his themes. And of course, there was and is a huge Jewish community in France, impacted by all the kinds of developments that were going on when France was revolting. And thank you.
I'm still stuck in revolutionary Paris. I don't think I'm ever going to leave Paris. It's now 1870 and I'm still...
It's still going on.
And then we have Abigail Green, Professor Abigail Green, who has returned for the second time after a fantastic presentation she gave us on Sir Moses and Lady Judith. And she's Professor of Modern European History at the University of Oxford. And one of the projects she's running at the moment, supported, I did have to look up the initials, the AEPJ, the European Association for the Promotion of Jewish Heritage and Culture, is looking at some of the great Jewish houses, literally physical houses. Some, no doubt, some of you have been to Waddesdon, and of course there's Hughenden and others, and this is being funded by the AHRC, the Arts and Humanities Research Council, and it's being done in collaboration with organisations like the National Trust. So we're going to hear all about what Jewish country houses are all about, and wonder how on earth, Tom, you got dragged into this.
Before I answer that, and thank you for that, David, I'm just going to go and pick up a puppy who needs to be brought inside. I'm going to literally be 10 seconds. I'm sorry to keep you.
Well, whilst he's gone, Abigail, you can tell us the truth, and then you'll have to make up for it somehow or another.
Well, I just knew Tom was the right person for the job. What can I say? I needed to have someone to lead it with me, and I understood that Tom would be perfect because his work does address these issues from a French angle. I want to see the dog, but I'm not sure.
He's chasing a pigeon. Okay, I thought he'd gone for a cat.
You mean getting a bird is okay, it's the cat.
I'm sorry for that very amateur beginning. We have just rescued a dog who I thought was vaulting over the back wall, so I had to scurry and try and retrieve him. But David, thank you so much for that introduction. I'm just going to share our screen. And I think it should be this one. And I will just go back to the start of the presentation. But thank you all for coming, and thank you for listening to the presentation, which does indeed talk about the project that Abigail and I have been working on, thanks to the funding of the AHRC. So this is a collaborative project that brings together European historians, Jewish historians, art historians, and curators. And you'll see some of us here. And this project focuses on a hitherto unidentified group of country houses, those built, acquired, and renovated by Jews, and takes them as the starting point for exploring the world of the Jewish aristocracy. So in this slide, you can see 6 of the core National Trust properties that we work with most commonly in the UK, and David has already alluded to some of them. So Hughenden, the home of Benjamin Disraeli; Waddesdon Manor, the home of Ferdinand de Rothschild; Nymans in Sussex, the home of the Messel family, and we'll talk about a variety of these in the paper tonight. So far from trying to identify a common typology, these houses all look quite different, we recognize that Jewishness takes many forms and is less about a sort of single architectural style than it is about relationships. Because while these houses today serve many different functions, what ultimately unites them is that they were all at some point Jewish homes. This history has been undervalued and underexplored because Jewish country houses don't fit into the kind of dominant paradigms of heritage that we have when we think of aristocratic landowners or metropolitan urban Jews. Jewish country houses fall between those two poles. And yet Jewish country houses could once be found all over late 19th and early 20th century Europe. Abigail. Abigail, I can't hear you.
I have asked her to unmute. I don't understand why she's not.
She might be frozen. I'm pleased it's not just me. We do a bit of a tag team.
I did request she unmuted, but she has. She's gone.
I suspect she might have left the meeting and come back in. She might have to do a quick sidestep. Okay. Can you hear me okay?
I hear you fine, but she's definitely gone.
Lovely. Okay, thank you. Have you been to any of these out of interest, David? Do you know these places?
Have you lost David as well?
David was having trouble with his audio, so it might just be really quiet. David might be speaking and we can't hear him.
He's definitely there and he's unmuted. So I'm not quite sure what's happening.
Carol, have you been to any of these?
I've been to Waddesdon. I don't think I've been to any of the others though. I'm sure there are people on here that have. Let's just see if we can get anybody back. Hang on a second. David is definitely still there. Abigail hasn't come back yet.
I wonder if she's, maybe there's a problem with her connection, possibly.
If anybody wants to comment, if anybody wants to unmute themselves and make any comments at any of the places that they've visited any of these homes, then please feel free to unmute while we try and get either Abigail, that's probably Abigail on the phone, Abigail back or David to speak loudly. Definitely can't hear David.
Is there a message there? There's a message in chat. But...
Let's have a look.
Great. So just to tell you which is which while you wait for Abigail to return. So on the top left, as I see it, is Hughenden, the sort of red brick Victorian, and that's the home of Disraeli. And actually, they've been much keener in recent years to talk about Disraeli's Jewishness. That was something the property did not really address until quite recently. And they've started to do exhibitions about Disraeli as, an Oriental in the perception of many kind of Victorian Britons. And so it's a very interesting property. In the top right is Waddesdon, which is modeled on a sort of French Renaissance chateau. It's the grandest of them. and was built by Ferdinand de Rothschild in the sort of 1870s and 1880s. Underneath Waddesdon, where you've just got the arch, this is part of what remains of the Nymans estate, which is down in Sussex, which is the home of the Messel family. And the Messels were German Jews who came over at the end of the 19th century. Very interesting kind of family trajectory. Oliver Messel went on to be a famous stage designer and kind of great figure in the arts in the 1920s and 30s. And it's the descendants of the Messels. One of them was Anthony Armstrong Jones. So the Messels ultimately end up marrying into the royal family, although the kind of connection back to Jewish was lost. Hi, Abigail.
I'm sorry, I had an internet failure. It won't happen again. What did you do?
I was purely saying a little bit about who lived in which house while we waited for you. So, you know, perfectly timed return.
Well, obviously, I hope that won't happen again.
We can hear you really clearly now.
Great. So where are you?
I'm waiting. I've got to your bit, Abigail. I've warmed everybody up and they're now ready for you to sort of take the floor.
Great. So you know all about these houses. Let's move on to the next slide, Tom. I think that's right. Some of them, these ones among them, are now museums of international importance, and there are some on the continent as well, like the Villa Ephrussi de Rothschild. But most Jewish country houses have been demolished or repurposed, in fact. So here's an example of a demolished house, but a surviving garden in Crawley, which belonged to the Montefiores, and the kind of house, the block of flats which occupies the space where the house was. But other houses have been repurposed as care homes, schools, or events venues, which trade on the titles and connections of their former owners. So they might have, I think this is a picture of, well, here we see the Rex Whistler interior of Port Limp, but you can book to stay in the Lloyd George suite, for example. And in the top left, you can see Charles and Betty de Rothschild at Ferrières in, I think, the Baroness's room. And some, of course, have become modern ruins hovering between memory and oblivion. And I'm particularly moved by Schloss Schenkendorf, which I tried and failed to visit. But there are some which are still, you know, have acquired a different kind of symbolic resonance, and probably the best known of those, though not in this country, is Theodore Reinach's Greek villa, which has become a kind of symbol of French and European culture. It's where Emmanuel Macron chose to dine President Xi before the pandemic started. And I guess it seems like a symbol of Greek culture on the Mediterranean, but as you can see in the library, there is a Magen David motif on the floor. So the varied fates of these properties speaks to the anomalous position their owners occupied in post-emancipation European society. In a rural landscape still powerfully structured by Christianity, so full of churches, Jewish country houses had a transgressive quality. But scholars of the English aristocracy like David Cannadine and Joe Mordaunt Crook have tended to treat families like the Rothschilds and the Montefiores as indistinguishable from other members of a kind of larger de-ethnicized diffuse group who Cannadine describes as the plutocrats and Crook as the nouveau riche, as in the title of this book. And our point would be that these are really quite loaded terms which replicate rather than interrogate the prejudices of the traditional landed classes. And, you know, I was struck when reading this book that Cannadine actually overlooks the historic exclusion of Jews as a group from the rights and privileges of the British establishment to such a point that when he's talking about Queen Victoria's reluctance to make the Rothschilds peers of the realm, he describes it solely in terms of old and new money and misses the elephant in the room, which of course is the Rothschilds' Jewishness, because the British aristocracy had always been open, in fact, to new money. It was a famously open elite. But when it became open to new Jewish money, something fundamental shifted, and this is central to our story. So to understand this, let's go back to the mid-18th century when foreign-born Jewish financier Samson Gideon bought this house, Belvedere, in Kent. but found he couldn't become a peer, acquire a title, because he was a practicing Jew. Gideon's children married out, and Belvedere ceased to be a Jewish home. But in the 19th and 20th centuries, many Jewish plutocrats chose to remain Jews in their marital and business networks, in their philanthropy, and in their international commitments, and they functioned in this way to some extent as a group apart. So we argue that the country houses of the Jewish elites shouldn't be understood simply as sites of assimilation, because they embody both that shift and that difference, and the submerged, often embattled place they occupy within the heritage landscape speaks to the difficulty of incorporating Jewish families and their houses into the stories we're used to telling about Englishness, the landed aristocracy, and in fact about Jews. So consider the fate of Mentmore, which was a Rothschild treasure house. It was designed by Joseph Paxton, who designed the Crystal Palace. Its collection rivaled that of the British royal family, and in the 1970s, its decorations, fixtures and fittings were all still intact. It was the most intact Victorian house in the country. But it proved impossible to save Mentmore for the nation, because even Mentmore did not seem sufficiently English. As the National Trust's Viscount Norwich put it when he was putting the case to the House of Lords, he said, "It's not in any way characteristic, not typical. It represents the international banker's Jewish taste of the Rothschilds, but surely it is no worse for that. Great art belongs to the world." So there's a kind of tension here between what we think about as English and something which Viscount Norwich understands as Jewish taste. And perhaps as a result, Mentmore was not saved for the nation, and its treasures were dispersed. Today, like similar houses in France, Germany and Italy, it's inaccessible, at risk, its future's uncertain. And although each of these houses, and here we have two houses in Italy and France, so in each of these countries, Britain, France and Italy, we can see that they have different kind of relationships with their built heritage. And with their Jewish past, and each country has its own particular history of anti-Semitism, and of course Britain is just the same. But still, it does seem in our projects that the fact that the Holocaust happened in continental Europe and not in mainland Britain has created a fundamental divide between the histories of the properties on the continent and the properties in Britain itself. Strawberry Hill House in Twickenham and the Château de Senef in Belgium are both celebrated as icons of 18th century national architecture. This is Strawberry Hill. And here you can see two generations of Jewish ownership. Lady Waldegrave, who was the daughter of a famous Jewish opera singer, and Geraldine Stern, who married into the Stern banking family. But it's one thing to exclude these people like the Jewish Lady Waldegrave and the Sterns, from the stories we tell about Strawberry Hill, which tend to focus on Sir Horace Walpole, who was the inventor of the English neo-Gothic. And it's obviously something completely different to present the Château de Senef in Belgium, which you see here, to the Belgian public with barely a mention of its last owners, the Philipsons, and to restore the house to its 18th century state as if, in fact, the Philipsons had never lived there, never altered the building, never planted an English garden, and never fled the coming of the Nazis who proceeded to occupy Belgium from what had been their family home. The silence in both cases is similar, that's the point, but the context gives it a completely different significance. But in fact, what we find is that on both sides of the channel, heritage professionals working with country house museums do find it very hard to integrate the Jewish story. So in December 2019, just before the pandemic, we held a conference for heritage professionals in Britain and one man from the Château de Senef. And we asked this question: what do you feel are the main challenges attached to telling the Jewish story? And you can see, if you look at the answers, that besides ignorance and a kind of lack of confidence, two factors seem to be key. The fact that these houses rarely have a kind of tangibly Jewish connection, so we don't often find Judaica, and the difficulty of fitting them into established stately home stories, which tend to be about continuity, family, rootedness and land. So what Tom and I are going to do is to juxtapose two British case studies which illuminate these issues. The Solomons Estate near Tunbridge Wells in Kent, which is an amazing place, and Upton in Warwickshire, home of the Bearsteads, which has an amazing art collection. Both houses belong to that group of Anglo-Jewish families Belmont famously called the cousinhood, and both families played a prominent role in the City of London, where Sir David Salomons became the first Jewish Lord Sheriff and later the first Jewish Lord Mayor, and Marcus Samuel, the first Viscount Bearstead, subsequently followed him as a Jewish Lord Mayor. Now, these are families who had complicated property networks. They had houses in Paris and on the Riviera as well. So the Salomons and Samuels were in fact cosmopolitan families with increasingly global horizons. And although neither were Zionists as such, both families did take an active interest in the social and economic development of Mandate Palestine, where Vera Salomons founded the LA Mayer Museum of Islamic Art. And above you can see the Bearstead Villa on the Riviera. So there's common ground between these two families, but the way in which Jewishness is now articulated in their houses is radically different. Private family narratives predominate at the Salomons estate, but in Upton it's all about the public display of fine art, even though in fact Upton still has a Jewish family who are living on the estate close by. So here is the first of these houses, Broom Hill, now an estate events venue, but once a grand Victorian mansion. In fact, it was originally conceived as a Regency villa in 1829, at a time when the right of Jews to own land was still uncertain and the campaign for Anglo-Jewish emancipation was just getting underway. So I think it's significant that David Salomons bought it in that year. And this remarkable neglected property owes its survival to his great-niece Vera, who was the last of her line, and there she is. So in 1937, she gave Broom Hill to Kent County Council, and she wanted the house to be used as a college, a museum, a scientific institute, or a convalescent home. She wanted the words David Salomons to form part of its name, so it's now the Salomons Estate, and she wanted 2 rooms to be used exclusively as a memorial hall, with mementos to her father and the late Sir David Lionel Salomons and his family. And there are additional pictures displayed elsewhere in the house and public access to the spaces where the mementos were. So by giving her childhood home to the local community, Vera ensured its survival as a family shrine. Responsibility for the objects and documents Vera chose as mementos was vested in the Jewish Board of Guardians, and further provisions were made to protect the Salomons' burial grounds. And this was after all the 1930s, a final clause which instructed the new owners of Broom Hill not to allow any instructions, speeches or entertainment of an anti-Semitic or political tendency to take place or to be broadcast in any of the buildings or part of the said property. Now, the museum has benefited from some professional curation, so it's not quite as Vera left it, but the small size of the collection means that it very much does tell her story. The old library is dedicated, that's the lower room, to the memory of her siblings, her parents and grandparents, above all her brother David Reginald, who died a hero in the Great War. Next door in the sculpture hall, we find memorabilia which relates to the career of her great-uncle Sir David Salomons. Above all, this bench, which you can see, which is where he forcibly tried to take his seat in the House of Commons after he'd been elected as an MP, but before he was allowed actually to function as an MP because he refused to take a Christian oath. And beyond the struggle for civil liberties, Jewishness is celebrated elsewhere in the museum. So there's this case which has, they've called it Family and Friends. It's got pictures of Jewish relatives, including Sir Moses Montefiore. Obviously, you've got the 10 Commandments there. And at the back, there's a stone from the Kotel, to which I'll return. In the cupboards of the old library, we also found an early Sephardic Siddur and a handwritten English prayer book, and a flyer which was produced after Kishinev. And there are 18th century vestments as well in the museum, which belonged to the private synagogue which Vera's grandfather had in his house at Hove. And even, in fact, this portrait of the three Salomon's women has a kind of Jewish subtext because it was painted by Abraham Solomon, who was a Jewish artist. And you can see along the bottom, there's a kind of Maggid David element to the decorative relief. But this painting, with its view in the distance, it's a painting actually of the room in which it's now displayed. And in the distance, you can see rolling hills and a church spire. So that reminds us, I think, that the life of the Salomons family was inextricably entwined with the British social and cultural context in which they lived. And in fact, that Jewishness was probably not always as present in the house as it is now. Vera's father, David Lionel Salomons, was an inventor, a scientist and a pioneering photographer. So we can use his photographs to see a bit more about how the house was lived in. And of course, there isn't anything particularly Jewish about these images, but that's probably not very surprising. I think it's better, as Leora Auslander has argued, to understand Jewishness as occupying a kind of episodic place. It pops up at certain ritual moments, but it's not going to be something which is always present in the house. David Lionel's parents had, in fact, been very religious. As a boy, he attended a school run by Sir Moses Montefiore's secretary, Louis Lurvy, who was a student of the Khatam Sofer, who was one of the great figures of East European orthodoxy. And Vera obviously had some Jewish education. When she visited Jerusalem in 1925, she was able to spout the little Hebrew I knew. And I'm sure you'll realise that wasn't all that common in 1920s Britain. In this period, Vera, interestingly, considered buying Waqf property right by the Kotel, which would enable Jews there to pray in peace. And it's possible that that was inspired by the peace of the Kotel, which she had been given as a family heirloom by her father in 1917 on the second anniversary of her brother's death and a week or so before the Balfour Declaration itself. But David Lionel himself, her father, obviously lived at one remove from Judaism. He anticipated a Jewish funeral because he said that the funeral should be in English, but he wanted to be buried in a field behind the little chapel at Broomhill Bank. So he obviously rejected established religion. This was a man whose public identity was thoroughly bound up, in fact, in science. And when he curated a souvenir album of Broomhill in 1898, he chose not to foreground the conventional attractions of his country seat, but rather to present the house as a giant laboratory and technological showcase, the first in the country where electric power was employed for workshops, domestic and other purposes. So this was actually the first electrified house in Britain, an achievement now completely forgotten, but once the focus of a multi-page spread in The House Beautiful, which you can see here, which also featured an article by Salomons on electricity in the home. Now, the way David understood his house as a marvel of scientific modernity maps only impartially on the museum which Vera created, which really focuses on different stories, not the resplendent scientific theatre which survives, which you can see here, where her father demonstrated his experiments, but on the more conventionally grand sculpture hall. But I think if we look harder, we can see parallels between the stories father and daughter chose to tell. So let's flick back to the beginning of that souvenir album. We're going to approach the house from afar, admiring the observatory and the landscaped garden. We're going to drive up to the gate. There's a little electric light bulb in the porch. And to our left, as we enter the house, is a billiard table, and next to it, the bench. At one end, under a canopy, in fact, there's a bust of the first Sir David Salomons. The next couple of shots feature images from the sculpture gallery, a combination of contemporary figures and classical motifs. But if we look closer, you can see at the back, there's a figure of Dick Whittington as under another canopy, in a further allusion to Sir David's mayoral career. Honouring the uncle who made him heir, David Lionel chose, we can see through these images, to thread the story of the first Jewish Lord Mayor through the prestige rooms at the heart of the house in much the same way that his daughter did. The Country House Sculpture Gallery was an aristocratic genre, but by emphasising the mayoral story and the Salomons' bourgeois origins, they gave it a different kind of twist, and the city became a source not of shame but of pride. And if we return to the museum his daughter left, we can see in fact that it's the city as much as the parliamentary story which takes centre stage in the sculpture hall. Tom.
Thank you, Abigail. And I should say, David said at the beginning, how on earth did Tom become involved in this? And I just want to preface it by saying I got involved because I'm a historian of collecting. And so what I'm going to talk about in this section is the collections that were kept in some of these houses or taken out of them. So as Abigail set up, we have with the Salomons a family in which the successive generations were very attached to the memorial or the commemorative function of their collections. But I think if we look at some of the objects that they chose to take out of Broomhill and that they donated elsewhere, we can see some of the other kind of symbolic locations that mattered to the family. So Sir David Salomons, the first Jewish Lord Mayor, was very proud of his picture gallery, and he urged his heirs to sort of pass it down and preserve it as an ensemble. Although today it's been preserved, we know from the catalogue that he collected works on Old Testament subjects, and that also he sponsored key Jewish artists, including this interesting figure, Solomon Hart, who was the first Jewish member of the Royal Academy, and also produced portraits of senior figures in the cousinhood, like Moses Montefiore. Sir David was also very generous with gifts towards the metropolitan institutions that he served, first as an alderman and then ultimately as Lord Mayor. His gifts were centred on the Guildhall, which, as many of you will know, is the historic and the institutional heart of the City of London. And these gifts included a silver group that he'd been presented by the Jewish community in 1836 to thank him for his efforts to fight for Jewish emancipation and religious liberty. Now, the mayor, David Salomons, his brother Philip, was perhaps the most pioneering collector of Judaica in Victorian Britain. And it's Philip Salomons, who had that private synagogue in Hove, who gives 400 volumes of Hebraica to the Guildhall Library in 1846. And so I think from these bequests, you can see how the Salomons want to stress the role of Jews and Jewish culture as central components of the City of London and its institutions. Now, if we go forward a generation, David Lionel Salomons, as Abigail has suggested, was much less closely connected to Judaism and the Jewish community. In fact, he's much more a figure of scientific innovation and a great kind of member of London clubs. He was also an ardent Francophile. And at one point, Broomhill contains one of the most spectacular collection of 18th century illustrated books in the country. You can see a French curator here at the start of the 20th century describing it as the Wallace collection of the book. And this was a really outstanding collection of French books. David Lionel was especially generous towards French institutions as well. We know that he and Vera spent a lot of time in Paris. And if you look at his will, he donates to French institutions both clocks, very important 18th century timepieces that were designed by Breguet. Some of you might know that he's the master watchmaker of the Age of Enlightenment, worked a lot for Marie Antoinette. So he bequeathed some really important Breguet watches, and David Lionel had been a biographer of Breguet, but also a whole set of prints on the history of transport. David Lionel was a real pioneer of the automobile in Britain, and the first motor show was held in Tunbridge Wells because of him. And he collected lots of these images related to transport that he gave to the French National Library. So what we want to stress is that at Broomhill, Vera decided to remove a lot of these objects that didn't fit with the very English story that she wanted to tell. Broomhill is almost the opposite, if you like, of a public museum. Public museums usually keep all of the great art and they take the private stuff out. By contrast, at Broomhill, it's the expensive art that was removed and donated elsewhere, and it was the intimate family stuff that was preserved in the house. As I say, the most expensive pieces that Vera removed were these astonishing 18th century watches that were part of her kind of founder's bequest to the L.A. Mayer Museum in Jerusalem. And this was a museum that she helped set up in the 1960s in order to foster dialogue between Arab and Jewish culture. So what I've tried to suggest here is that there's a great diversity of collections and that there's also a kind of geographical fragmentation of collections. And this fragmentation, I think, tells us something about the family's multiple loyalties and identities as Britons, Londoners, Europeans, and Jews. So I just want to quickly run now through our second example we're going to be talking tonight, which is Upton House in Warwickshire, which is the rather austere country house that belonged to the second Viscount Bearsted, Walter Samuel. When the house was offered to the National Trust after the Second World War, they were initially rather sniffy about the architecture. They thought it was a pretty undistinguished house, but they were extremely excited about the collections. And you can see this quote here from the diaries of James Lees Milne, talking about the picture collection as fine as any private collection in England. Today, it's the collections which are still the centerpiece of interpretation at Upton. And if you go and visit, the rather thin official guidebook that you buy makes only a single mention of the family as Jewish. Instead, it implies that they only bought the house, when they bought the house in 1927, this was their first taste of country living. As I'll show in a moment, that's quite mistaken. The guidebook really minimizes the differences between the Bearsteds and their rather aristocratic neighbors, and it tries to present the house as a gateway onto the sort of country house weekend of the 1930s. So it tells us a lot about the Bearsteds' enthusiasm for hunting, but it doesn't say anything about the cottage that the Bearsteds kept on the estate for the family rabbi. Now, just like the Salomons, the Samuels were also very much a London family. Much of the week, we know that Walter Samuel was working in London as the chairman of Shell Oil. And so he was only really going up to Upton to host weekend entertainments or to take part in hunting. It was never really the family's primary residence. At Upton, Walter Samuel had the squash court converted into a picture gallery. And that's what you see at the bottom of the screen here, this kind of remarkable private gallery to house his painting collection. And the architect who did this for him was Ernest Joseph. And Ernest Joseph was the man who built the Shell headquarters that I'm sure many of you know on the Embankment, this amazing Art Deco building. Ernest Joseph was also a major figure in Jewish charities in the 1930s and 1940s. Now, it's this desire to try and the National Trust has left some of this Jewish urban story out. But more recently, this desire to sort of reinstate the metropolitan context has been made by Robert Whaley Cohen, who is the husband of Lord Bearsted's granddaughter. And he's chosen to write an alternative history of the Upton estate where he still lives. So he was a grandson of Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, who is the president of the Board of Deputies and was an important early director of Shell. And so he's a member, if you like, of the cousinhood. And as a result, this kind of alternative or partial history of Upton suggests a really instinctive grasp of what was singular and what was different about these Jewish families, including their pride in having made their fortunes in the city of London. Indeed, his own father, Sir Bernard Whaley Cohen, had also been a Jewish Lord Mayor. And you'll see here in this stained glass window from a city church, the Bearsted coat of arms and the Whaley Cohen coat of arms presented together. So the Bearsteds made their fortune thanks in part to the development of the British Empire. Walter's formidable father, Marcus Samuel, had built a huge shipping empire in the 1860s, profiting in part from the opening up of Japan in that decade. And by the 1890s, he was the first man to oversee the passage of petroleum through the Suez Canal. He is Marcus Samuel. So this is the man who founded Shell. In 1891, he becomes an alderman. And then finally, in 1902, he becomes elected as the third Jewish Lord Mayor of London. He uses this platform in order to protest against pogroms that are happening in Russia and also in Romania. And during this period, his daughter Nellie, who we'll hear a little bit more about in a minute, becomes the first Jew to be married in the Mansion House, which today is still the official mayoral residence. Now, in 1895, Marcus Samuel bought the family's first country house. So this is 30 years before the purchase of Upton. This house is the Moat. It's a very fine looking Regency property, which is just outside Maidstone, which had 500 acres and is where Marcus Samuel threw himself into hunting, fishing, shooting, and cricket. After Marcus Samuel's death, the land around the Moat was given to Kent County Council, and so it is now the home of Kent County Cricket Club. It was built on the grounds of the estate. And interestingly, Maidstone became a major site of the family's philanthropy at this time, most striking of which is the amazing collection of Japanese arms and armor, 2,000 Japanese objects that Walter Samuel had amassed and were donated to Maidstone Museum in the 1920s, which are still kept together in a special Bearsted wing. So I think to sort of bring some of this together, I think the collections can give us really important clues about the family's passions and the family's interests. Walter Samuel continued to honor his father's memory at Upton, both by keeping scrapbooks and material related to his father's time at the Mansion House, but also that there are lots of objects in Upton which quite subtly point to those metropolitan connections. For instance, in the top right, this porcelain figure of John Wilkes, which you find at Upton today. Wilkes, as many of you know, was also a very important radical politician in the 18th century and a key mayor of London. Now, Marcus Samuel was also a regular donor to the Guildhall Art Gallery. So once again, the centrality of the Guildhall, as with the Solomons, bequeathing important Victorian works by Leighton, Millais, and Watts. This Watts painting that you see at the bottom of the screen was actually something he'd bought to raise funds for the Red Cross in 1918. And so it's important to see that these gifts are linked to a bigger kind of politics of cultural philanthropy, a bigger sense that art should be for public benefit. Like many other Jewish aristocrats, the second Viscount Bearsted, Walter Samuel, was heavily involved in communal charities, including the Council for German Jewry, but he's also a major figure of the National Arts Collections Fund, which is what we now call the Art Fund. And if we look at some of the donations he made through the Art Fund, you'll see how he's putting works on Jewish subjects in the heart of some of Britain's national collections. So in the bottom left, you'll see this lovely portrait by Isidor Kaufmann of a rabbi from Vienna in 1910. This is a gift Lord Bearsted gives to the Tate in 1929. Lord Bearsted and his sister Nellie are also fundamentally important to the development of the London Jewish Museum, which was created in 1932. They provided funds and they helped purchase some of the star pieces in the collection. So over time, what I want to suggest is that their philanthropic connections and their cultural activities become increasingly interconnected. For instance, in 1939, at the Lord Baldwin sale at Christie's, Bearsted donated this portrait by Thomas Lawrence in order to raise funds for Jewish refugees from Nazi Europe. And this was a cause that he championed throughout the 1930s. In 1936, we know he went to the US in order to meet President Roosevelt to try and raise awareness of the plight of Jews in Europe. And he was also a prime mover in funding the Kindertransport, which was actually organized or administered in part from Upton. And he worked very hard with other senior Jewish figures to ensure that the cost of bringing these 10,000 children to Britain didn't fall on the British taxpayer. So as a final example, before I hand back to Abigail, of how politics and culture fit together, I just want to point to his work also at the Whitechapel Art Gallery in the Jewish East End. The gallery had been founded back in 1899, and due to its location, it was very quickly a key resource for Jewish immigrant communities who were keen to make use of its Yiddish library. From its early days, Whitechapel exhibited Judaica, as well as the work of kind of cutting-edge Anglo-Jewish painters. Today, when we think about Whitechapel, we often think about it as a site of modernism. And in the 1930s, it was the only gallery in Britain to exhibit Picasso's Guernica, for instance. When the Guernica went on tour in 1939, the only place you could see it in England was at Whitechapel. However, in reality, the gallery's finances were very shaky, and its program was much more eclectic. It's the appointment of Walter Samuel as chairman of trustees in 1943 that's really a transformative event for saving Whitechapel as an institution. There's a trustee report here that suggests that he's the refounder of Whitechapel Art Gallery. He takes over as chairman at a time when the gallery is putting on shows by German Jewish refugee artists in order to kind of raise awareness of the plight of Jews in occupied Europe. And you'll see this lovely woodblock poster. And this involvement with Whitechapel reflects the family's deep connections with other parts of the East End, in particular in Stepney, where his brother, Gerald Samuel, who died in the First World War, had been a key figure in running the Stepney Jewish Lads Club. So Walter Samuel takes over at Whitechapel, becomes chairman of trustees. He puts the finances in order. He brings in friends from the city. He widens the educational mission. And lastly, he also loans pieces from Upton to this gallery in the East End. So in 1948, there is an Old Masters exhibition organized at Whitechapel, quite a rare feat for the gallery at that point. And this is the same year that he makes over the house to the National Trust. And so these pictures are presented to the public, again, as part of the common property, as part of the national heritage, effectively. A few years later, his son, the third Viscount, does an even bigger show from Upton at Whitechapel. And the vast proportion of the Upton pictures were exhibited in the gallery in 1955. This show in Whitechapel was a huge success. We know it had over 500 visitors a day. And in a deprived working class community, which had recently been ravaged by the Blitz, I think its symbolic impact is hard to exaggerate. And there's a nice quote here that suggests how the show brought together different constituencies in the East End. It combined the kind of people who read Country Life and who loved Old Masters, the kind of people who might go to the Wallace collection, with a much more popular Jewish East End audience. So I just want to end, before I hand back to Abigail, by saying the Solomons and the Samuels were self-confident dynasties who were not trying to ape the aristocracy. Rather, they advertised their connections to the City of London, and they treated the Guildhall as a platform for Jewish assertion. Here's another example. Here's a painting of Viscount Bearsted, which was donated to Guildhall Art Gallery. In their country houses, they wanted to commemorate their achievements, but in ways that were more appropriate to the different rural setting. At Broom Hill, Vera pruned the collections to create something more intimate and a more sort of anglicized memorial. Whereas at Upton, although the family's origins can initially seem a bit obscured by all of these trappings of wealth, these wonderful kind of Georgian works of art, if we think about how these works of art circulated, how they kind of operated beyond Upton, we can see that this is a misleading impression. For Lord Bearsted's collections remained completely enmeshed with the more metropolitan and Jewish dimensions of his life. Back to Abigail for the coda. Abigail, you're on mute.
In the coda, I'm going to think about the role of country houses like Broomhill and Upton as sites of Jewish memory. So the English countryside obviously only represented one aspect of their social lives. They were London families, really. But oddly, it's in small towns like Maidstone and Tunbridge Wells and on their rural estates that the memory of the Salomons and Bearsteds is most alive. And I think there are parallels here with other families, so we're going to widen the scope a bit. Some of you may be familiar with Sir Moses Montefiore's country house in Ramsgate, which no longer stands, in fact. He died childless, and here you can see two iterations of the house. The second one below was developed by his nephew Joseph Seabag. So the house itself has been destroyed, though you can visit the greenhouses. But hidden down a little footpath, the Montefiore synagogue and the museum associated with this lost house survive. And we can see how amazing it must have looked with also a rabbinical college attached to it when it was there in its full glory, and how, in a way, out of place in an English context. I think it's telling that Sir Moses chose to remember his wife here, to build the kollel here, and to create an institution here in Ramsgate, which was his country home, rather than in London, which was so much a part of his life, and the city of his birth, and where he too had been a sheriff, following Sir David Salmons as the second Jewish sheriff. But I think people would have forgotten him in London more easily. In Ramsgate, there's still the Montefiore Arms, which I hope has survived the pandemic. And the mayoral chain has the Hebrew letter Mem on it because it was given by Sir Moses when Ramsgate became properly incorporated. So there are kind of mementos here. And in fact, Ramsgate is less unusual than we might think. So most people have usually heard of the Montefiore Synagogue at Ramsgate, but by contrast, Worth Park, home to 3 generations of Montefiores, is a truly forgotten house, except in Crawley. But it was once so intimately associated with the town of Crawley that souvenir china, which you can still buy second-hand, featuring the name Crawley, also features the Montefiore's coat of arms with the distinctive Hebrew banner bearing the word Jerusalem. The point is, these Montefiores were closely related to the Ramsgate Montefiores. They were descended from Sir Moses' brother Abraham and his wife Henrietta Rothschild. They too were pillars of the Anglo-Jewish community. They were community leaders, observant Jews, and prominent Zionists. And visitors to their house, which was incredibly lavish, noted, for example, that there was a mezuzah by every bedroom door. So this was obviously unusual. But like the Salomons, this was a family which died out. Abraham's grandson, Sir Francis, was the first and last baronet of Worth Park, and when he died childless in 1935, that was it. But 5 years before he died, he had gifted the village hall, which his mother had built for the local community, and here you can see it, to the community as the Montefiore Institute. So it's a shabby building, but very popular amongst locals, and inside we find a kind of Jewish variant of the ancestral portrait gallery, which you've probably noticed when you visit more classic aristocratic country houses. So there's a picture of Sir Francis, there's a picture of his parents, Joseph and Henrietta, and there's this picture of the Montefiore family themselves, a kind of origin myth image with Moses and Abraham both as children in the late 18th century. And I call it an origin myth image because it's an image which you can find actually in a lot of family homes belonging to members of the Seabag Montefiore family. And you're about to see one coming up, I think. So as sites of memory associated with more or less forgotten houses, and as philanthropic foundations rooted in specific places, Broomhill, Ramsgate, and Worth Park, the Montefiore Institute, all speak to the real connections which these families forged with local communities in rural England, and to the fact that they were proud of who they were, not aristocrats, but English Jews. And these memorials are distinctive in a British context because they don't fit an established pattern of behaviour among the non-Jewish elite. And actually, it's distinctive in continental Europe as well, where Jewish dynasties like these tended obviously to meet with more brutal ends. And we're just going to consider very briefly one German example, the country house of Walter Rathenau, Schloss Feuernwalde, which was actually a Prussian royal palace before he acquired it. So Rathenau was assassinated in 1922. He was a Jewish foreign minister of the Weimar Republic associated with the Rapallo Pact. And at Feuernwalde, he restored the house as a memorial to the old Prussian culture of the turn of the 18th century. And when he died, after the assassination, which was a major cause célèbre, his sister gifted the house to the community and wanted it to be a memorial not just to the old Prussian culture of the turn of the 18th century, but also to Rathenau himself. So it served a dual function, the function which he himself had envisaged as a symbol of the good side of Prussia and a memorial to the man who had been assassinated. And I think what's interesting is that for Rathenau, this house actually was characteristic. It embodied the good side of Prussia, and it didn't represent the international Jewish banker's taste of the Rothschilds, which we saw Viscount Norwich identifying so confidently with meant more. What he was trying to do was to say that he too, a Jew, could understand what it meant to be Prussian. Today, Schloss Weinwalde is on the at-risk register. It was restored after the wall came down, but it's not viable as a museum, so you can buy it for €1 if you can come up with something suitable to do with it. And at one level, the message of our project is simple. To make sense of properties like Freienwalde, Brumhill and Upton, we need to read them side by side. But obviously the story these houses tell is more complicated than that, because I think the excision of Jewish life from continental Europe created an obligation to remember at a national level, which is missing in Britain. But there isn't anymore a local connection which is felt in the community to the people who lived in these houses, which is exactly what you see in places like Brumhill, Ramsgate and Worth Park. And one thing which is striking, I think, is the way in places like Germany, it's very much the Jewishness which is foregrounded in the stories people tell about these houses. But in Britain, the Jewishness recedes, and the stories people tell are by and large stories about class, which you'll have seen, for example, with Upton, but which is also very present in the kind of work which locals are doing at the Worth Park Visitor Centre. But in fact, the intersection, so the connection, the crossover between class and Jewishness was central to what happened to these houses in the 20th century and the different functions they served. Whether in Britain or Germany, their owners were the only Jews to possess great landed estates, to travel, live and marry internationally, to play key roles in modern banking and finance, and to move in elite social and political worlds. Though they were a Jewish aristocracy, but it's wrong to understand them as assimilated, because these families also formed the backbone of the modern structure of Jewish diplomatic and philanthropic networks and institutions. Take the Warburgs or the Warburgs, who, like the Samuels, combined business with artistic interests. So they're a German Jewish banking family with branches in Britain and the US, where they built the Joint Distribution Committee, which was a Jewish institution which still survives, and which during and after the First World War sent hundreds of millions of dollars to Jews in Eastern Europe and Palestine who were caught in the crossfire of war and revolution. So this was something which the Warburgs coordinated, which was really a humanitarian effort second only to that of the US government. In Britain, meanwhile, the Rothschilds of Waddesdon Manor became committed Zionists, instrumental in obtaining the Balfour Declaration, who provided money to buy Jewish land in Palestine and for medical services there, and who later helped to fund the core democratic institutions of the State of Israel, obviously the Knesset, but also the Supreme Court, and now the National Library. So the point is, and really, that the country houses of both families testify to these histories of Jewish and philanthropic activism. After 1945, the Hamburg Warburgs recovered their family villa at Blankenese and gave it over to young Jewish Holocaust survivors. Before this, the Rothschilds of Waddesdon had helped to underwrite the Kindertransport and housed several dozen kinder on their estate, so they were known as the Cedar Boys and Girls. And at the home of the Rothschild Foundation, Waddesdon remains an engine of international Jewish philanthropy even today. And this is a different aspect of the story, but one we haven't got time for now.
Thank you. I don't know if David is able to rejoin us. I think he's having trouble with his sound. Abigail, can you take the screen down? If anyone's got any questions, and people can, at least you can see everybody. David, are you able to speak? David, I can't hear a word you're saying. It's lovely. It's a wonderful experience, I must tell you.
If you want to
Okay.
type something, David, we can look at the chat, I'm sure.
Okay, if not, has anybody got any questions? If you want to, yeah, Dave, do you want to unmute? Can you unmute yourself? Yes, you can unmute yourself.
Hello, good evening, and thank you very much indeed, Abigail and Tom, a really fascinating presentation. I wanted to ask you about the role of the country house Jews in the Anglo-Jewish Association, which of course was founded at the beginning of the era that you're talking about. And it seems as though they are surprisingly absent in a way, I think, with the exception of Sir Robert Whaley Cohen, who you mentioned. The AJA was sort of the province of the Goldschmidt and Mercator families to some extent. But we think of the AJA as being sort of the Jewish aristocratic association in contrast to the Board of Deputies. But it seems that families that you were primarily focused on, the Samuels and the Salomons, were not involved in it. Is that right, or have I missed something?
Well, I'm not sure about their involvement in it, but I would say that the Goldsmiths are absolutely country house Jews. They have a country house called Summerhill near Tunbridge Wells, in fact, very close to where the Salomons estate was. And as you say, the Goldsmiths were founders of the AJA, and they founded it. Well, it was connected to the Alliance Israélite, but it was partly, I guess, a way for Goldsmith, who was a Reform Jew, to have a platform because he wasn't allowed to be on the Board of Deputies, because at the time Reform Jews were barred from it. And the Mercators actually were extremely close relatives of the Montefiores, and I have to say, I think the Mercators are one of the most interesting Anglo and unstudied Anglo-Jewish families of all. I mean, they're very closely associated with West London Synagogue. They're still heavily involved with it, having been the family which really started it. And they did have, I think, a smallish country house. I think we have a feature about it on our website. I forget where it is. So I wouldn't see them as not country house Jews. I think they are Reform Jews, and it's maybe reflecting a slightly different strand within the Jewish community, or within the cousinhood, really.
Indeed, and also famously, the AJA were not supporters, or the leading lights in the AJA were not supporters of Zionism either.
No, well, you might identify that also. So, I mean, I think that's true in the sense that, so you might see that, I think, related to the connection between Reform and Orthodoxy, because the Montefiores were very closely associated with the Board of Deputies. So Sir Moses obviously helped to refound it in the 1930s when it was given a constitution. But the Montefiores of Worth Park, so Joseph Mayer Montefiore was de facto president of the Board of Deputies when Sir Moses became too old and had a more honorific role. And Sir Francis Montefiore was a leading British Zionist. But it's clear that both Montefiore branches were much more observant. So in that sense, they were following a different religious tradition. But I think you're right that this aspect hasn't been well brought out by the literature. It's quite interesting to think about.
Thank you.
Thank you. Has anyone else got
20th century?
Has anyone else got anything else they want to add? In my day job, I work for the Association of Jewish Refugees, and there was a lot of resonance of what you were talking about in relation to the places of interest. And I don't know, has Alex Moore's been in contact with you about the project? So you're up, because I was busy, as you were talking, I was busy looking through. We've got a tree project. We're going to be planting 80 trees. Whether any of those are any of the places that you've spoken about as well. But I just want to make sure that you're in contact with Alex. I had a feeling you were, but I just wanted to double check with the interactive map that hopefully will be launched fairly soon, which will show places of interest to refugees. That's just a personal question.
No, and I'm grateful you raise it. I mean, Abigail has been working with the Holocaust Education Trust to put together a pilot to think about how you could use these houses as places to teach the Holocaust. You know, because at the moment, obviously, there's a lot of emphasis on trying to take school children to Europe, but actually thinking about how that European history has, you know, cast very deep shadows and kind of has meaningful connections with sites across Britain, I think is a really interesting opportunity. And because these families were so cosmopolitan, the owners of some of these country houses had relatives who were profoundly caught up in the Holocaust. And so there are really strong local echoes there to follow up, as well as the story of how these houses became sites of refuge for DPs and sites of Jewish relief after the war.
Thank you. I'm going to close now. David, it's just very strange seeing him with it muted. So on everyone's behalf and David's behalf, I want to thank you. That was absolutely fascinating. I'm really glad it was recorded, because I think I need to watch it again slowly and make some notes, because there was so much information you were giving us, and I got a bit confused. So I just need to watch it slowly and make some notes. It was absolutely fascinating and really appreciate.
Can I suggest that if you're able to do this, you should go on a synagogue outing to the Salomons estate or Upton. But, you know, Salomons especially is well worth visiting. And because it's not a national, you know, it's actually very easy to visit, but because it's not a National Trust property, it doesn't get the same level of publicity.
I'll leave that back to David with his Belmont Shore hat on. Thank you very, very much, Abigail and Tom. It was absolutely fascinating. I can see people are clapping all over the place. And really just thank you very, very much for giving up your time to us this evening. And all the best with the continuation of your project. Thank you.
Thank you
so much.
Very,
Have a nice
very
evening,
good.
everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very good.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thank
Good
you.
night.